This is the slippery slope fallacy graphic that's become very popular on Twitter, and it's about right? Basically, it shows a curve. It's a downward curve, and it's kind of gradually curving down, and then boom, it drops off a cliff. And it has a bunch of arrows pointing to the gradually downsloped curve saying, you're overreacting, you're overreacting, you're overreacting, and then we are here pointing to the bottom of the slippery slope. And this is what keeps happening with Democrats on policy after policy after policy. They keep saying, you're overreacting. We would never do that. Not in a million years would we ever advocate for the most extreme formulation of the position that you're suggesting that we hold. And then, inevitably, about 5 years later, we're at the bottom of that curve. And this is a very big problem for Republicans because Republicans keep believing this stuff. You have a bunch of civility-oriented Republicans who will say, no, they don't actually, let's give them civil unions. They'll never want the gay marriage. We'll give them gay marriage. They're never going to want to force you to do it in church. Okay, so they're trying to force a baker to bake a cake for a gay couple. But does that really mean that they're going to come after you if you refuse to go along with their morality and how you teach your kids? Well, sure, they're doing that with the schools, but you think they're actually going to come into your home? If you keep going along over and over and over again with the lie that the slippery slope fallacy is in fact a fallacy and not a prediction, then you're going to end up at that bottom of the curve over and over and over again. And this is why I think Democrats are having a particularly tough time these days. They're having a particularly tough time because people can see that we are at the bottom of this curve. People can see that over and over and over again when Democrats assure us that we're just at the top of the curve and that we're overreacting. They don't actually want the things we say that they want. We can see that they're fibbing. And Joe Biden had an opportunity when he came into office to basically overthrow that idea, right? Joe Biden was a figure of the status quo. Joe Biden was a supposed moderate. He was not somebody who was going to go along with the gradual lowering of that curve and then the drop off the cliff. He was going to stand like a rock in the pathway of Democratic attempts to go radical. Joe Biden was not Bernie Sanders. Joe Biden was not Ibram X. Kendi. Joe Biden was just, a typical Democrat, middle of the road Democrat who was never going to allow American society to slip off that curve and all the way down to the bottom of the cliff, Wile E. Coyote style. Except that Joe Biden did precisely that. And what we see over and over and over again is that Democratic politicians seem patently incapable, really since the end of the Clinton era, to tell their own base no. And to make the case to the American people that they should be believed when they take a moderate policy. Because over and over and over again, outlying members of the Democratic Party, people who were considered crazy 5 years ago, are now considered central members of the think centers of the Democratic Party. Bernie Sanders was a nut for all of his Senate career. He was a useless nut from Vermont. He had somehow been elected because Vermont is a weird state filled with progressive people who live in conservative ways. It's a very strange state, Vermont. And so they elect Bernie Sanders in the whitest area of America. They elect Bernie. And Bernie, for 30 years, does nothing in the Senate. He's a complete useless person. He's a backbencher who shouts about why there should only be 4 types of deodorant on the shelves. And then all of a sudden, he's a thought leader. Because it turns out the Democratic Party, as always, falls off the cliff. Or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, when she first entered Congress, the idea was, so fresh, so face, but kind of extreme, right? I mean, we're not actually going to follow her down the primrose path here. And then she's on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine. Over and over and over again, the Democratic Party demonstrates that they are willing to fall off that cliff. They are eager to fall off that cliff. They lie to you. They say that they're not, but they're willing and eager to fall off that cliff. There's been a lot of talk about polarization in American politics and what the left will call asymmetric polarization. What they will suggest that the right-wing Republican Party has moved further right. That is not true. You cannot name a position on which the Republican Party, except for perhaps immigration, has become more right-wing over the course of the last 20 years. That position does not exist. It doesn't exist. I can name you half a dozen positions where the Democratic Party has moved significantly to the left, ranging from their tax policy to their policing policy to abortion to same-sex marriage to the transing of the children. Just over and over and over again, Democrats move significantly to the left. If there has been a polarization in terms of policy positions, you can say that the Republican Party has polarized in terms of its stylistic moves. Like Donald Trump was stylistically different from Republicans of the past who were much more conciliatory and more civil. And by the way, the reason that Donald Trump was elected was because he was not conciliatory and not civil, and because so many Republicans were angry at the conciliatory civil Republican Party that it seemed to go along with the lie that we were going to remain on the top of that slippery slope curve. Okay, but Republican, in terms of their positions, their policy positions, they have not moved to the right. If you look at the Republican platform in 2004 and you look at the Republican platform in 2020, they're basically the same. It may be to the left, actually. Right? You now have mainstream members of the Republican Party voting in favor of enshrining same-sex marriage at the federal level after Obergefell. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party has moved wildly to the left. And so here is the problem for the Democrats. No one believes them anymore when they say they are not pursuing utopia. And so all Republicans have to do is point at the bottom of the slope. Now, we're not there yet, and Democrats will continue to argue that we'll never get to the bottom of the slope. But here's the thing. You shouldn't believe them. You shouldn't believe them because they're saying out loud what they want. Take, for example, Beto O'Rourke, Beto over in Texas, right? So the first time he runs for Senate against Ted Cruz, he campaigns as a moderate. And he's somewhat of a moderate Democrat running in a very red state, and he loses a close election to Ted Cruz. Then he runs for president, and he says, we're going to take your AR-15s, and we are going to come after your religious institutions to remove their nonprofit status if they don't act in ways that I like with regard to social policy, particularly same-sex marriage. And this is all stuff that Beto O'Rourke said. And that was like a 2-year gap between when he ran for Senate and lost to Ted Cruz and when he ran for president. That was maybe a 1.5-year gap. And all the quiet parts he started saying out loud. It was the same thing, by the way, if you go all the way back to, say, 2011. Barack Obama was against same-sex marriage in 2011. By 2013, he was the greatest advocate of same-sex marriage. So was that because he actually shifted his position, or was it because he was lying in the first place? And he was lying to the American. The answer is he was lying to the American people. He was always progressive on that issue. He just had to lie to the American people because the American people didn't agree with him. And you see this over and over. Well, you keep doing this over and over, and people aren't going to believe you anymore. So all Republicans have to do is point at what the end of that arc looks like. What does the bottom of that slope look like? Are Americans willing to go there? Because while Democrats keep claiming they'll go this far and no further, we have no evidence to believe that this is the case. Historically speaking, we have no evidence to believe that when given the opportunity, Democrats will not shove us over that cliff every single time. So, for example, as we talked about on the show, there is a Virginia Democrat who has now introduced a bill to prosecute parents who refuse to treat children as members of the opposite sex. According to Yahoo News, Virginia Democratic delegate Elizabeth Guzman is seeking to introduce legislation that would hold parents criminally liable for refusing to treat their children as a different sex from the one they were born into. The legislation, which Guzman plans to introduce in Virginia's upcoming legislative session, would expand the definition of child abuse, so parents could be charged with a felony or misdemeanor for refusing to honor their child's request to be treated as the opposite sex. Guzman said if the child shares with those mandated reporters what they are going through, we are talking about not only physical abuse or mental abuse. What the job of that mandated reporter is to inform Child Protective Services. Now, I've been warning about this for years, and there's going to come a time when Democrats, if given enough power, would sic Child Protective Services on any parent who refuses to go along with the lie that their boy is a girl. The move came in response to Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin's latest policy initiatives, which empowered parents to exercise control over whether and how children transition gender in school, which, of course, used to be called the status quo. The status quo used to be called your boy is a boy and your girl is a girl. Glenn Youngkin took the moderate position that if your boy seeks to be treated as a girl in school, at least you got to tell the parents. And this is too much for the Democrats. They say that should now be considered child abuse. Again, if you think the Democrats aren't moving in this direction, I question as to why you would think that. And what makes you think that Joe Biden, if freed of all of the burdens of governance, if freed of public opinion, would not do that? He has said that healthcare requires that we trans the children. Healthcare requires hormones for 9-year-olds who say they're a member of the opposite sex. Gender-affirming healthcare requires that we carve fake vaginas into boys at the age of 16, 17, 18 years old. This stuff is very important. So why wouldn't it be considered child abuse if a parent refuses to go along with it? Again, the end point of the slippery slope is there specifically because the principle being established by the Democratic Party encompasses all of that. If you truly believe that it is child abuse to refuse to go along with the delusions of your child with regard to their own gender or sex, delusions promoted by a socially contagious media apparatus that creates virtue in not believing that you are a member of your genetic sex. If that's your principle, why wouldn't that extend to the notion that a parent is abusing their child for not going along with all of that? I mean, we're already on the verge of that in California, right? California, as we mentioned yesterday, has become the first sanctuary state for transgender youth seeking medical care. So if you and your spouse disagree on whether your boy is a boy or your boy is a girl, and you grab your kid and you go to California and you start transing the kid, California now says that you are immune from prosecution. They will do nothing about that. It's questionable as to whether even if a minor decamped from their home in, say, Oklahoma to California and started receiving transgender care without the permission of their parents, that would be any sort of problem in the state of California. The bottom of the slippery slope is there, and it is visible, and it is in sight. It is not a mirage in the distance. It is the vision of the bottom of the cliff as you are falling. And what Democrats keep telling you is that you jumped off a 100-story building, 95 stories down, everything's okay so far, you haven't hit the ground. But the ground's coming closer, and we are going to hit it. And so if you wish to defeat the possibility of us hitting the bottom of that slippery slope, you actually have to put roadblocks in the way near the top of the slippery slope. And Democrats are being very clear about what it is they want here. It's not as though they are really hiding the ball. I mean, they lie and they say, well, we're not seeking to create a social contagion. We're not seeking to take your kids away from you. We're not saying that you can't raise your kids. That's exactly what they're saying. It's just a question of how long it takes for them to get to the logical endpoint of what it is they're already advocating. Alrighty, guys, the rest of the show is continuing right now. You're not going to want to miss it. We'll be getting into why Liz Truss just lost her job as Prime Minister of the UK. If you're not a member, click the link in the description and join us.